In the grand theater of global power, where nations vie for influence and control, what happens when a superpower decides to simply walk away? Not with a bang, but a whimper. Not with a declaration of victory, but a silent, almost imperceptible retreat. This isn't a hypothetical. This is the unfolding reality of America's posture in Africa, a continent once considered a crucial chessboard, now seemingly abandoned by Washington. The implications are staggering, not just for Africa, but for America's standing on the world stage. Before we dive into the stark truth of this strategic surrender, do us a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement fuels our mission to bring you these vital, often overlooked narratives. Last week, the White House issued an executive order that barely registered a ripple in the mainstream media, yet it marked a seismic shift, the complete cessation of financial assistance to Africa. This wasn't a policy debate or a public declaration. It was a quiet, almost clandestine act. Donald Trump, ever the showman, has, in this instance, opted for the silent treatment. The plug has been pulled on Africa with a chilling finality. No more aid, no more guarantees, and crucially, no more boots on the ground. There were no grand speeches, no warnings, no diplomatic fanfare, just a silent withdrawal cloaked in the sterile language of efficiency and burden sharing. But why now? And is this truly a masterstroke of strategic genius or a colossal misstep that even the most skilled spin doctor couldn't transform into a win? Donald Trump prides himself on his deal-making prowess, on his ability to bend situations to his will and emerge victorious. Yet in Africa, he may just have orchestrated a strategic blunder so profound, so utterly miscalculated, that its repercussions will echo for decades. This wasn't a loud, defiant retreat designed to send a message of strength. Far from it. This was quiet, calculated, almost surgical. A few military bases shut down here, a handful of aid agencies quietly slashed there. There was no grand exit, no triumphant declaration of a mission accomplished. Instead, it was the slow, deliberate disassembly of America's decades-long footprint on the continent, piece by agonizing piece. At first glance, Trump's second-term strategy in Africa appears deceptively simple. Save money, shift risk, and compel African nations to shoulder their own burdens. A neat, tidy package, wrapped in the rhetoric of self-reliance. But the reality unfolding beneath that polished surface tells a vastly different story. One where Trump isn't pulling out because he's in control, dictating terms from a position of strength. He's pulling out because, for the first time in a very long time, he's lost the leverage. For decades, the United States maintained a precarious balance, one foot firmly planted in Africa, the other in global dominance. It could afford to intervene selectively, training troops here, dropping aid there, all while maintaining a comfortable distance when things inevitably spiraled into chaos. But Africa has changed. The world has changed. And what Trump, in his myopic focus on America first, seems utterly incapable of grasping is this fundamental truth. Walking away doesn't free America from responsibility. It doesn't absolve it of its past actions or future consequences. No, in a brutal twist of fate, it strips America of relevance. In his misguided attempt to shrink America's role in Africa, Trump may have inadvertently, catastrophically, shrunk America's power. While he remains fixated on protecting the homeland, convinced that a fortress America is a strong America, the rest of the world is not standing idly by. They are protecting, and indeed expanding their positions in Africa. China is building, constructing infrastructure that reshapes the continent's economic arteries. Russia is maneuvering, offering security partnerships with fewer questions asked. Turkey is investing, forging new trade and cultural ties. Even the Gulf states are entrenching themselves, establishing formidable economic and diplomatic footholds. And as each new player digs in, America's absence grows more glaring, more visible. Not as a threat to Africa, but as an undeniable sign of U.S. decline. This is where Trump fundamentally miscalculated. He assumed Africa needed America more than America needed Africa, a dangerous, outdated assumption that hasn't been true for a very long time.
The strategic architects in Washington, perhaps still clinging to a bygone era of unchallenged supremacy, likely anticipated a specific reaction to their African retreat. They expected shockwaves. They expected panic. They envisioned a continent in disarray, leaders scrambling, begging for the return of American presence, American dollars, American guidance. What they got instead was a silence that spoke volumes. The continent barely flinched. There was no widespread outcry, no desperate pleas, no emergency summits convened to lament the U.S. departure. The silence wasn't gratitude. It was, in a far more damning indictment, indifference. Trump left, and Africa adjusted. In the myopic worldview that often dictates foreign policy from afar, retreat is frequently perceived as a power move. You leave the negotiating table, confident that your absence will create a vacuum so unbearable that others will come chasing, desperate for your return. But Africa didn't chase. It simply turned to the next available option, a pragmatic pivot that exposed the hollowness of Washington's assumptions. In many regions, this meant the rapid formation of new security pacts, a heavier reliance on burgeoning regional forces, or, in a development that must surely sting in the halls of power, a willingness to engage directly with China, Russia, or Turkey. Trump believed he was holding leverage by walking away. In reality, he merely walked off the stage, and the show, with new acts and a fresh script, continued without him. Consider the stark lesson of Niger, once home to one of the U.S.'s most advanced drone bases at Agadez. When the military leadership shifted and the U.S. packed up its assets, it wasn't merely a logistical exercise. It was intended as a potent message. Without us, your security collapses. But that message, delivered with such assumed authority, utterly failed to land. Niger's government didn't beg for the base to stay. They didn't plead for a reconsideration. Instead, with a quiet resolve, they started looking east. They opened their doors to Russian advisors, exploring military technology deals with Ankara, and most tellingly, began asking harder questions. If American drones had been here for years, why did the insurgency still spread? This is the uncomfortable truth of Trump's miscalculation. The absence of tangible results meant there was no inherent loyalty to the American brand. For years, the U.S. had offered training, some tech, tactical knowledge, and grand war games like African Lion. Yet, on the ground, the insurgencies consistently outpaced the training. Local commanders often found American support slow, fragmented, and hopelessly tangled in bureaucratic red tape. So, when Trump withdrew forces, African local armies didn't feel the sting of betrayal. They felt the cold weight of reality. They had always been, in essence, alone. Now, they simply stopped pretending otherwise. And this is precisely where Trump's grand strategy implodes. He wanted to shift the burden to African states without ever admitting how little actual burden America had truly carried. The Pentagon might boast of 6,000 personnel in Africa, but spread across over 50 nations, most were trainers, intelligence liaisons, or logistics officers. It looked impressive on a PowerPoint slide. On the battlefield, it meant little. So now, as the U.S. presence fades, African militaries aren't suddenly failing in Trump's absence. They are, with grim consistency, failing at the same rate they were when he was still there. This isn't a defense of their struggles. It's a damning indictment of Washington's overinflated self-importance. Trump thought pulling troops would make African leaders nervous, desperate for a return to the familiar. But in many capitals, Accra, Bamako, Luanda, the sentiment wasn't fear, it was clarity. Clarity that the U.S. had never been a dependable security partner. Clarity that new arrangements were not just desirable, but urgently needed. Clarity that African solutions must, unequivocally, come from within the continent, not from a far-off capital whose interest comes and goes with election cycles. The strategic discipline the U.S. once inconsistently imposed is evaporating, leaving a vacuum. And that chaos, while it won't knock on Trump's door immediately, will inevitably come. Because security vacuums, as history repeatedly teaches, never stay empty. Trump thought he was saving face by pulling back. Instead, he's watching his influence unravel, not through confrontation, but through quiet, undeniable irrelevance. Africa didn't need to revolt, it just needed to stop waiting for American approval.
Trump, in his characteristic hubris, walked off the table expecting the entire game to fall apart. He envisioned a continent paralyzed, its leaders bewildered, its security unraveling, all desperately awaiting his inevitable triumphant return. But here's the twist, the profound irony that Washington still struggles to comprehend. The table didn't flip. It didn't collapse into chaos. It just got bigger. And now there are new players operating with different currencies, adhering to different rules. And Africa, once condescendingly viewed as a mere prize to be won, is learning how to deal the cards. This is the part Washington didn't see coming. Because yes, Russia is circling, offering military support with fewer strings. Yes, China is building, weaving a vast web of infrastructure and economic ties. But something else, something far more significant is happening too. African governments aren't merely picking sides between global powers anymore. They are negotiating with them, playing them off one another, signing deals with one hand while subtly rewriting contracts with the other. And this isn't chaos, it's a sophisticated, calculated strategy. Trump's exit didn't freeze the continent in uncertainty, it accelerated its political learning curve, forcing it to mature at an unprecedented pace. Look no further than Burkina Faso. After France and subsequently the U.S. lost their sway, the government didn't collapse into the predicted power vacuum. Instead, it consolidated. Military leadership under Ibrahim Traore didn't just kick out foreign forces with a flourish of anti-imperialist rhetoric. He replaced them systematically with bilateral cooperation tailored precisely to Burkina Faso's terms. Russian advisors were welcomed, yes, but not worshipped. Their presence was transactional, serving specific security needs. Local industries were prioritized, a stark contrast to the extractive models often favored by Western powers. And most remarkably, African alliances, such as the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, emerged not as Western puppets or Eastern proxies, but as resounding declarations of autonomy, of a new unified African agency. This is what's unfolding across the map. In Ethiopia, the government flirts with Chinese financing, yet fiercely refuses to cede sovereignty over its internal security. In Senegal, Western-backed democratic institutions coexist, often uneasily, with burgeoning Gulf-funded economic zones. In South Africa, BRICS membership doesn't signify ideological loyalty, it means enhanced bargaining power on the global stage. This is Africa's new diplomacy. Non-alignment, not as a passive stance, but as an active leverage. The world expected Africa to choose a side, East or West. What they didn't expect was for Africa to start writing its own terms, dictating the conditions of engagement. And that's precisely where Trump's absence becomes a profound liability, not for Africa, but for Trump himself, and by extension, for America. By removing America's influence, he has, ironically, removed America's options. The continent hasn't stopped making deals, it's simply stopped asking permission. And what's filling the space isn't chaos, it's a burgeoning, sometimes volatile, but undeniably real confidence. That confidence isn't always stable. It can be wrapped in authoritarianism, fueled by populism, or manifest in radical shifts. But it's rooted in something profound. A generation of African leaders, civil actors, and crucially, a vibrant youth who no longer see Washington as the undisputed center of gravity. This isn't just about military partnerships or foreign bases. It's about who gets to define the narrative. In the past, U.S. embassies dictated talking points, shaping perceptions through their immense media reach.
Today, regional broadcasters, online influencers, and a burgeoning Pan-African media landscape are shaping the conversation. African youth don't wait for CNN to tell them what matters. They see the world through WhatsApp threads, encrypted chats, and streets buzzing with anti-imperialist slogans. And that matters more than most policymakers in D.C. understand. Because when Trump pulled out, he didn't just lose terrain, he lost credibility. And in the new Africa, credibility is currency. It's not about who has the biggest economy or the most missiles, but who shows up without condescension, who listens, who adapts, who doesn't assume ownership of Africa's future. That's what China learned early, what Russia is learning now, what Turkey and even India are testing with increasing sophistication. They come not as saviors, but as options. Trump, by contrast, comes with exit plans. And while he frames his disengagement as strength, Africa, with its newfound clarity, sees it as surrender, not of power, but of relevance. Here's the kicker. Even as new players enter the field, Africa is becoming less dependent on all of them. Digital innovation, burgeoning intracontinental trade, the exploration of new currencies, the solidification of Pan-African security pacts, these aren't fantasies anymore. They're frameworks being piloted, adjusted, and in some cases already implemented. And Trump? He's watching all of this from the sidelines, still convinced the game is rigged in his favor, not realizing the board has fundamentally changed, the rules have shifted, and he's not even holding a seat. So the question now isn't who will control Africa, it's how long until Africa controls the conversation itself, and what happens when it does. Outro. The silence from African leaders speaks volumes. There are no angry condemnations, no fiery press conferences begging for American presence. That's the part Western analysts still misread. Africa isn't protesting America's exit. It's simply replacing the need for America altogether. This is the final, quiet sting in Trump's strategy. He didn't just walk away from a partnership. He made himself replaceable. Once upon a time, the U.S. had something no one else could offer: military dominance, development dollars, global media power. But in the space Trump has left behind, those advantages are starting to feel outdated, even clumsy. China's infrastructure is coming faster. Russia's support comes with fewer questions. India, Turkey, and the Gulf offer nimble, flexible packages. Even regional African blocs are innovating with their financing tools, security mechanisms, and diplomatic alternatives. And Trump? He's watching all of this from the sidelines, still convinced the game is rigged in his favor, not realizing the board has fundamentally changed, the rules have shifted, and he's not even holding a seat. So the question now isn't who will control Africa, it's how long until Africa controls the conversation itself, and what happens when it does.